I'm Inc. Executive Editor Diana Ransom.
And I'm Editor-at-Large Christine Lagorio-Chafkin.
This is From the Ground Up.
Today's episode, Trump's first 100 days.
So, Christine, we had a roundtable discussion where we featured a bunch of Inc. staffers. So we had senior writer Jennifer Conrad and Melissa Angell, who's our policy correspondent, and staff reporter Brian Contreras in to talk about basically the hottest topics that we could talk about that fell within the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, because obviously that's happening right now. And it's a big deal. You know, we talked about cryptocurrency, and basically this is the one sort of industry that should be happy right now.
Trump is not exactly a crypto regulatory president here, right?
No. And, you know, it was funny, too, because we were like, you could tell this was going to be a crypto fan presidency, basically. There was the crypto ball during the inauguration.
Oh, yeah.
And then, of course, we know a lot of crypto industry people basically supported Donald Trump. And, you know, he was on the podcast tour and all the crypto bros were out in full force.
Not to mention some pardons.
Yes, of course. Yeah, we talked about that, too. So we get into a lot of good stuff. And, of course, we talk about tariffs. Mm-hmm. This is like the hot button issue of the moment. I mean, this is going to be significant for small businesses and consumers alike.
Yeah, I feel like every American business owner is nail biting right now and actually hustling to try to keep up with this. 3 reporters that you talked with are on top of it. I think almost most of everyone on our staff.
Yeah, and it was great, too, because I felt like each one of them had written about tariffs before. So everyone kind of had their own tariff story, and everyone has done, you know, they've all individually spoken to business owners, and so we have that perspective in there. We also talked about the Small Business Administration, and it's, you know, it's like the linchpin for any business. Most businesses that are trying to raise growth capital, you know, a lot of them rely on Small Business Administration loans or loans that are backed by the Small Business Administration. So we wanted to stay up on the changes there. And finally, we talked about taxes and the IRS and Elon Musk a little bit, too.
Well, I can't wait to hear that stuff. What did you start off with?
So, yeah, I asked Melissa Angell to give us the latest on the SBA.
It's difficult to know where to begin. The cadence of this news cycle is certainly a whirlwind, but I think the easiest and the place that makes most sense to start is the change in administrator. We have Administrator Kelly Loeffler, who is now leading the SBA under the Trump administration, and she's very much a loyalist to the administration. She was one of President Trump's top donors, but she's also an entrepreneur.
What kind of business did she start?
She started a fintech firm. I believe it's pronounced Backed. Now it sells software to trade cryptocurrency. But I think what's really interesting is that a bulk of her career has been in the financial services industry. So she worked at the Intercontinental Exchange and helped them go public. And that's huge since they also own the New York Stock Exchange. And she helped shepherd that acquisition as well back in 2013. Besides being an entrepreneur, she also has experience as a politician as well. She was the senator for Georgia.
Mm-hmm. She was the appointed senator.
Correct. And she served about a one-year term. When she was in Congress, she was also one of the wealthiest members of Congress at the time. And a large bulk of that is because of the combined net worth she has with her husband, who was the co-founder and CEO of Intercontinental Exchange.
Which also goes by the term ICE.
Yes.
Which, not to be confusing.
Right.
Okay, so ICE acquired the NYSE in 2013, and they just have a ton of money, and she's putting her financial acumen helping the Small Business Administration now. Pretty cool. Yeah, looking forward to seeing what she does with that. So the SBA, for our audience, has been around for 70 years. Its mandate is to basically supply lending resources and other resources to the 34 million small businesses across the United States. But its mandate recently changed. Melissa, you want to catch us up on how its mandate changed?
Right. I think one of the biggest changes that I've been paying attention to is how the SBA will now be taking charge and accounting for this $1.6 trillion student loan portfolio that it has now assumed from the Department of Education. And this is This is monumental. This is something we haven't seen before. And I think what's really worth taking a look at is student loans are made via promissory notes, right? And so what that means is those are legal documents, and that directs the student borrower to repay their loan to the Department of Education. This is codified in statute. This isn't only just in the U.S. Code. It's also in the Higher Education Act of 1965. And what really begs the question then is, does the SBA have the enforcement authority to collect on these loans? This is something that some activist organizations have said it kind of endangers the portfolio potentially if it's not in statute, because federal agencies, they're not fungible here. So that's certainly something to watch.
Well, I mean, it sounds like they are, but the problem is that Congress actually has to be doing the tearing down or the dismantling versus Elon Musk.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's something we've also seen the administration do with multiple federal agencies, going and circumventing Congress. And because Congress, at the end of the day, is the one that has the power to kill off a federal agency. But what the Trump administration has done is they've gutted agency resources, and it's effectively the same thing.
Well, so that's a good segue. So on the same day that they announced that they were going to move the student loan portfolio over to the SBA, they had another announcement that same day, right? What did they say?
They also said that they were reducing the size of the SBA by 43%, which I believe is a reduction of about 2,700 jobs. And so the SBA, under Administrator Loeffler, she has said that, like many entrepreneurs, their mission will stay the same, to do more with less. But the SBA, as for those that have covered it well know, is the agency has often long been viewed as understaffed. And so the question I've been asking is, will they be able to go out and carry out their mandates of servicing the student loan portfolio while also serving the nation's entrepreneurs with thousands of less staffers?
Absolutely. No, you must question that. What is the small business community saying about this?
I think for those who are as chronically online as myself, I like to go to the Reddit subthreads of small business. And a lot of people are curious about just what collections are going to look like on their SBA loans. Under Administrator Loeffler, she has said that they are going to ramp up the collections process. They're also going to clamp down on fraud, is something that we've seen this administration be very stringent on. So a lot of business owners are wondering just what also the cadence will look like in terms of interacting with the agency. Sometimes the SBA's customer service hasn't always been sterling. So that's something to watch out for.
And also just it bears mentioning that they had to staff up majorly during COVID. And some of this reduction in force is the COVID hires that they made.
Correct.
From what I understand. So they're trying to get back to quote unquote pre-pandemic levels. But the agency really only had a couple thousand employees pre-pandemic. So this is definitely makes you wonder whether they're going to be able to handle the mandate going forward in the new expanded mandate.
Right. They're also hiring a new fraud czar. So very curious to see what that's going to look like as well. The fraud czar was the inspector general, which they've effectively neutralized alongside other agencies as well.
Right. No, and speaking of other agencies, the IRS has been getting brutalized. So heading into this year's tax season, they had 102,000 employees roughly. And the announcement recently was that they're about to get rid of around 40% of their staff. So, Brian, you've been doing some tax coverage for us, and you've been writing about the IRS reduction in force.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about what would happen if they got rid of 40% of their staff?
Yeah, I mean, so they started off with laying off around 6,000 or 7,000 recently hired provisionary employees who are a little easier to let go than sort of longer-term employees. And then more recently, on April 15th, they said that 22,000 employees had taken essentially a buyout offer to stick around until September on payroll but not really do work. They are resigning in the short term if they take this offer. Now, these are sort of like the fork-in-the-road offers that Elon Musk has been offering a lot of agencies, and a lot of those are facing sort of court scrutiny. So it's not super clear yet like what the final body count of these cuts will be. But there's been reporting from IRS insiders that they are aiming for 50% reduction in the agency overall. So it could be even further beyond what we're seeing right now. And that number, I believe, is including like normal attrition rates. But still, that's a massive cut to basically the chief way our federal government gets the revenue that funds all sorts of social services and government programs. So to your point, what does this mean? You know, we're sort of past the 2025 tax season. At this point, it could impact auditing still as we sort of, the government starts looking at what people have filed. That's, talking with tax experts and tax agencies recently. That's been something they've talked a lot about, is a decrease in auditing, which obviously that impacts the government's ability to fund various programs because it has less revenue. There's also, similar to the SBA, concerns that this is going to impact customer service, wait times if you're trying to call them for help. It is pretty significant cuts that have already happened and massive cuts that are on the way, especially if these buyout offers go through.
I don't think I'm any stranger to feeling like a little bit ambivalent about these cuts. Frankly, most people are not big fans of the IRS.
Sure.
So it is kind of funny to be like, oh, woe for them. But at the same time, it is a problem because that's how this nation generates revenue at this point. And without that, other programs start to fall by the wayside.
And the people who get away with tax fraud are the ones who stand to benefit. If you are cutting the IRS's ability to enforce the on-the-books laws about taxes, the people who stand to benefit most from that are fraudulent individuals and companies.
It's been long said that smaller businesses, basically, they can't necessarily afford to hire the fancy, high-priced tax accountants like bigger companies. So they're already basically shouldering a lot more of the tax load than the nation's biggest companies. So theoretically, without those auditors in place, they'll have even less ammunition to go after the bigger companies that might be the tax cheats.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen these cuts compared to sort of at a company getting rid of your accounts receivable department, where this is that is what this is for the federal government. Like, this is how they get money that funds, again, every manner of program, including, I would imagine, a lot of stuff that directly impacts small businesses.
Yeah, I mean, there's also talk about in phase 2 of these cuts, they're talking about getting rid of, or a high number of cuts in their compliance department. Mm-hmm. And this is the IRS. Compliance department for the IRS is probably really significant and important. I mean, there's potential for cybersecurity incursions. When we're talking about our own private information being sort of at risk here, that's a concern I think I have as a private citizen, much less as a business owner.
Sure, and there's already been talk about DOJ going in and accessing taxpayer data. There's sort of a parallel question about the Department of Homeland Security and ICE accessing taxpayer data specifically related to undocumented immigrants, which is sort of a parallel thing. But beyond that, there's also this new DOJ agency going in and looking at taxpayer data. And in other agencies, at least, we've seen cybersecurity concerns around that sort of access from people who are not relative newcomers to a particular government agency.
Mm-hmm. And Jennifer, you've been writing about cybersecurity for us for a few years. Are you hearing any rumblings or anything about this?
I think what you're seeing is that because you have a lot of people using unauthorized systems, most famously when war plans were discussed over Signal, which is an encrypted messaging app, there are concerns that information may be leaking out of government agencies that would normally be held in secure systems where you have to physically be on site in a room with no unauthorized devices. So there's that. The other thing that is potentially happening is that CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, they are seeing a reduction in force, which could potentially affect things like critical infrastructure and government cybersecurity. And there could be trickle-down effects for smaller businesses, even though they are not necessarily directly working with CISA.
We've been reporting on this over the few months, is basically AI is helping enable cyber hackers to be even more efficient. So even if your business was maybe not a target before, if AI can help these fraudsters or hackers basically get you faster or more efficiently, then you might need to worry. So it is good to have a nation that is well prepared for this situation. So let's also talk about the tax situation. I know under Trump's first presidency, his crowning achievement was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that was 2017 was when it passed. This was a big deal for our audience. So let's talk about the tax bill that is up for proposal. So basically, you have all these provisions that were in the 2017 bill that are coming up or that are coming due, that are about to expire by the end of this year. And so there's a big fat deadline on this situation. What are you hearing? What are the rumblings in Washington?
It seems like Republicans are generally unified in wanting to renew a lot of those sunsetting provisions that are set to expire at the end of 2025. So in early April, the House approved a preliminary budget plan for, this is what Trump's been calling his big, beautiful bill, sort of this big tax bill that's going to renew some of the TCJA 2017 tax cuts, also add new ones potentially. So the House and Senate are now sort of on the same page at...
Wait, did they actually approve this already? The $5.3 trillion budget?
Yeah, so the House and Senate are now on the same page about how much money they're willing to spend or how many taxes they're willing to cut. Now they sort of have to get into the weeds and figure out what that looks like. But they have basically set aside $5.3 trillion in tax cuts. $3.8 trillion of that is the renewals of the TCJA extensions. And then there's another $1.5 trillion of wiggle room, which is... there's been a number of different proposals from Trump on the campaign trail and at his recent sort of pseudo State of the Union before Congress. This is like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime pay, no tax on Social Security benefits. Some of these sort of new ideas he's put forward, those could potentially be part of that sort of $1.5 trillion in additional cuts they've left for themselves, sort of on top of the TCJA renewal stuff.
Well, that's a nice amount of wiggle room there. So the no tax on tips, that's always interesting because whenever you talk to a tax expert, they're like, people are going to game the system. They're just going they're going to get paid in tips now just to avoid paying taxes. So you have that concern as like, okay, if this actually does happen, people will game the system. Anyway, $1.5 trillion worth of wiggle room is pretty fascinating. So how is he going to pay for all this?
Well, they've talked about cutting government programs. I mean, that's obviously always tough to do, especially for Republicans that are going to be in vulnerable seats come election season. But like, there's already talk about Medicaid cuts and other government services cuts.
Yeah, I've been hearing about the Social Security situation. They're shutting down Social Security offices. So some people who currently are on Social Security have to drive upwards of 200 miles just to go to a Social Security office to collect their check, which now has to be given to them in person.
Yeah.
They can't do it online anymore because there's concern about fraud.
Yeah, I mean, you're already seeing some schisms within the Republican Party about sort of now that they have set these numbers they're trying to hit in terms of tax cuts and savings. Where is that money going to come from? Every time you cut a tax, you either have to make up that money elsewhere. We'll obviously be talking about tariffs a little later. That's one thing. The one way they've talked about sort of making up that deficit. But, the other way the government accounts for tax cuts is by cutting services, and that always impacts voters who then get to make their voice heard at the ballot box. So we'll see how that plays out both in these negotiations and then come election season.
Totally. And that's a perfect segue for Jennifer, our conversation. So let's move on to tariffs. I mean, this is the big thing. This is the bombshell for us. I mean, it hasn't even been 100 days yet, or it's been nearly 100 days, and we've basically seen federal agencies gutted, different programming just change hands like that. And then, this announcement about tariffs, early April. Take us back. What happened?
So tariffs, as the president would say, the most beautiful word in the English language. And, Trump has often used economic policy as a way of trying to coerce various countries to do things that we want to, or to, in some cases, make up for legitimate trade concerns with other countries, say, heavily subsidizing an industry so that American products can't compete with what they're making. So on the campaign trail, he said he was going to unleash a whole lot of tariffs, and he did.
And nobody thought he would, apparently, or a lot of people thought he wouldn't do it.
I think a lot of people thought they would be more targeted and that the rates would be lower. And so he issued a few tariffs on Canada, Mexico, auto parts, China, and then we got to April 2nd.
And these are Canada, Mexico. We already had NAFTA and the USMCA.
US, Mexico, Canada.
Agreement?
Yes, agreement.
So these are effectively allies who basically turn around and get a 25% tariff.
Right. So essentially we have this agreement with Mexico and Canada. So we have these integrated supply chains where, say, if you're making a car, maybe you'll make a part in Canada and then bring it to the US and do some work on it and then take it to Mexico. And so companies will have their supply chains in all three countries and factories in all three countries. And normally those products could cross the borders duty-free.
So we have this integrated supply chain that's just been there for decades that is basically going to have to change or is already shifting, theoretically.
Theoretically, and the idea behind the tariffs, which we should say are taxes on imported goods, and they're paid by the person who imports it or the company that imports the goods. So theoretically, these tariffs will make goods that were produced overseas more expensive and therefore make American products more competitive and will bring more manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.
How much does Donald Trump's administration expect to raise through tariffs? But here's where that is, I feel like, flawed, because if his plan is correct and people bring production back to the United States, then he doesn't have the tariff revenue. So then what happens?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Because the whole idea is to create an incentive structure where people are shifting their buying to domestic companies that don't have the tariffs and
then if we
are
don't
more
have
competitive.
taxes.
Right.
Well, I guess we wouldn't have income taxes, but theoretically businesses would still have to pay corporate taxes.
Sure. Yes.
I don't know. It's fascinating. It's like an intellectually fascinating question to come across. But when you're actually a business owner and you're actually dealing with these issues right now, I mean, it's like you can have as much fun as you want kind of like thinking about this, but when you're actually having to deal with it, it's a real crisis.
Well, and it gets to something, Jennifer, you've covered a lot, which is that it's not even clear what exactly the administration is trying to get out of these. Sometimes they say we are trying to keep fentanyl out of our country, and this is sort of just a bargaining chip. Other times they're talking about we want to reshore and reindustrialize, the Rust Belt.
Yeah.
And even negotiations with Japan over these tariffs are happening right now. And I saw yesterday the Japanese negotiators were, I guess, leaking to the press that it has been very hard to negotiate with the White House because what the White House is saying they want changes day by day or person by person, which I think is sort of indicative of a larger lack of clarity around what Trump is using these tariffs for. Is this a revenue stream? Is it a negotiating tactic? Is it a plan to bring iPhone production back into the Midwest? Like, what is the end goal here?
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of it, too, is like to keep people guessing. This is like the whole art of negotiation that he's known for.
Sure.
Of like, you keep people on their toes so they don't know what to expect.
And that makes sense if you're trying to use that as a negotiating tactic with other countries. I can see the logic there. That is also very tough. I've spoken with a lot of venture capitalists and private equity people who are really having a tough time allocating money in funds right now to private companies because it's not clear what the landscape is going to look like. If you invest in a retail or a manufacturing interest now, who knows what that looks like in 6 months if they rely on, Chinese products or precursors or whatever.
Totally. I mean, that's what we've heard from survey after survey. It says business owners, like, what do they not want? Uncertainty.
Sure.
That's, how do you plan for that? You can't. Like, you don't know what your supply chain is going to be. You don't know how do you need to change it because you don't know what you don't know what the problem is. And if it's going to go from, 145% tariffs one day and then goes back down to 10% the next day, I mean, you really honestly have no idea what you're doing.
What's so funny is if you had the modeling is just so off. And if you had an investment banker working in a firm have models this off, they'd be fired in an instant. The Trump administration has claimed that tariffs could bring in as much as $7 trillion in funding over the next decade. Okay? That's their claim.
Yes.
The Tax Policy Center estimates that tariffs will likely bring in about half of that. So around $3.3 trillion from 2026 until 2035. And then for this year alone, it's only expected to generate about $190 billion worth of revenue. And so it barely makes a dent in our deficit, right? And there's also all this talk about even the administration propping up a so-called external revenue service where it would reap in this so-called profit, but the math isn't adding up, right? And at the end of the day, it's not going to be enough to make up for how much the country's spending.
And then is this going to be in the big, beautiful bill? Like, are they accounting for all this?
I don't think so. I wouldn't masquerade as an accountant, but and at the end of the day, it always comes down to the 11th hour with these things.
When we come back, we explain exactly what stacked tariffs are and their impact on the global economy. But first, a quick break. Please, somebody explain what a stacked tariff is to me.
When I speak with business owners, I can't shake this line that someone recently told me, and that she said, I just woke up, so I don't even know what the tariff is today.
Oh, funny. I mean, sad.
There's so much volatility in this landscape. And so we also can't forget that there are prior tariffs from the past administration, the past Trump administration, where they never were phased out. And so this is what's known as a stackable tariff. So say you have a 10% tariff that was implemented, companies pay that.
Like a directed tariff, like on steel, for instance.
Yes, exactly. And so that never goes away. So you're still paying that as a business. And then when you have this new announcement that there's another 25% tariff, well, that gets stacked on top of that last 10%. So now you're looking at a 35% surplus there, right? And so then when we're talking about triple-digit tariffs, as the president has floated on China, it just becomes insane.
Yeah. This is why people end up paying upwards of 245%. And by the way, from what you all have been reporting, people are leaving their goods in crates abroad, basically.
Because it's cheaper.
Because they can't even afford to get their products out.
Right.
Because they can't afford the tariffs. Okay, so that's ridiculous. Another change that's been happening is this whole de minimis thing. What is that?
What's known as the de minimis exemption, sometimes called the de minimis loophole, is a century-old law that essentially allows packages that are worth less than $800 to enter the United States duty-free. It's been used widely by e-commerce sites such as Temu and Shein, but it's also used by many, many, many drop shippers, just used by regular people receiving packages from abroad that are worth $800. And the idea behind it is that it frees up customs resources, so they're not having to screen every little package, and also just makes it easier for e-commerce to happen and for goods to travel overseas. It's been in the crosshairs of both the left and the right, particularly as Shein and Temu have taken off.
But it's not just Chinese companies that are benefiting from this, right?
Oh, everyone does. So many direct-to-consumer brands hold their packages in warehouses and then ship them directly to consumers from, say, Canada or Mexico or sometimes Vietnam. There are a lot of e-commerce businesses that are going to have to rethink their model now.
And when does this exemption go away?
So starting May 2nd, for both China and Hong Kong, the exemption will expire. And there has been talk about it expiring for other countries as well.
Okay. So with, the discussion about de minimis, it's all relative and related to this conversation about tariffs. What are you all actually seeing business owners doing on the ground? Are they wringing their hands? Is it like
Yes.
untenable?
A lot of people were stockpiling before the announcement, right? Those that had the foresight were going to their suppliers, they were looking at their supply chains, and they were saying, how much can I buy and how much can I store as well? Because if you're buying thousands of units, you also have to put that somewhere, right? And not everyone has the luxury of doing that, especially if you're based in New York City, where real estate is, top tier. So that's one thing. I spoke with one business owner. She purchased thousands of cartons because she was producing microgreen kits. And she stockpiled these. And what I love is her husband actually built her a shed to put them in.
Wow.
Right? If he wanted to, he would. So I think that's...
She got a she-shed out of it.
Right. There she did. So I think that's one really interesting thing. Jennifer and I recently did a piece on bonded warehouses, which I think is an excellent hedge for how we're seeing tariffs fluctuate so much.
Yeah. What's a bonded warehouse?
So that it doesn't allow anyone to evade tariffs. That is, first and foremost, we have to make that clear. But what it allows people to do is you store your inventory in a part of the warehouse where it's also sectioned off. Usually if you see photos of it, it looks like there's a chain-linked fence. It's really, it's hardcore. And it allows someone to not pay a tariff until that item exits the warehouse, until it's sold, basically. So that's one way.
So basically, if you think that Donald Trump is going to reverse course on tariffs, you leave it in the bonded warehouse for a period of time.
Yes.
To let him come to his senses, right? Or whatever it ends up being.
That's the hope.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a gamble, right? Because at the end of the day, the inverse could also happen.
But demand for these warehouses is surging.
Skyrocketed.
Yeah. And how much do they cost and where are they?
The cost of bonded warehouses usually are higher compared to non-bonded space. I believe it's $1 per square foot in addition.
Yeah, I would say, let's see, generally 75 cents to $1.50 a month per square foot versus a regular one, which might be
It's generally more expensive,
generally like maybe 20% more or so.
but it's not unattainable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's important to remember. But it also doesn't make sense for every business owner to look into one. If you don't have runway concerns, that's something where this helps you extend your
What
runway.
business doesn't have runway concerns?
Right? I mean, I want to be in
also
that boat.
this is a good question too. It's like, so are businesses doing anything interesting with their capital right now? Are they drawing on their credit lines, or they, you said they're buying inventory. They were buying inventory significantly prior to the announcement. Are they drawing down their credit lines? Do they need this reservoir of cash just in case?
One thing I've heard from a lot of business owners is that they're just halting unnecessary spending. I spoke to a coffee shop owner in Arizona, and he is building a new cafe, and he cut back, I think, $50,000 worth of expenses, construction expenses, just to save his capital. But that also means that's $50,000 less that he's not putting into the economy, and he's cut back on hiring new people because he doesn't want to have to lay them off. There's a lot of paralysis right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of just not spending.
Well, I saw also it was an X post from Ryan Peterson, who's the CEO and founder of Flexport. He was saying that at least two of his clients that he was aware of that basically manufactured in China have effectively sold their companies to the Chinese counterpart. They're like backing out. They're out of the game entirely. And, if he's seeing it a couple of times, it's probably happening more and more across the country.
I saw a related story with the founder of Busy Baby, which is sort of a baby products company, who is saying that her products are stuck in China. She has $160,000 worth of merch in two containers in China. Isn't going to bring it into the U.S. under the current tariff regime just because she's willing to swallow the cost of the merch, but not additional cost of tariffs. And she's thinking about just selling it on Chinese markets to Chinese customers because American customers right now are inaccessible.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. And Jennifer, in some of your reporting, you've learned this too, is that there's some things that just like literally cannot be made here. The Busy Baby example, there's this food grade silicone is the issue.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, you've done reporting on the actual glass bottles being, some manufacturers normally got them from Canada. And then if you actually have a U.S. supplier of the glass bottle, they don't fit in the machines like the Canadian ones for whatever reason. So some things just like, it probably could be done here, but we don't have the resources or the capacity now to do it. So when we're talking about these tariffs, when you're just flipping a switch, these things just aren't built. They're not like, we're not ready for it yet.
This is a big issue. A lot of business owners have said they would like to reshore most of their manufacturing if they could, but we don't have the industrial equipment and expertise. Even something like an iPhone, that injection molding that has to be precise. For the most advanced iPhones, the equipment, the expertise is only in China. And we're talking about millions, if not billions of dollars that would have to go into building these factories in the U.S.
Yeah. I just saw a post from Lauren Lockwood. She's the CEO of a company called Lion Latch. This has been a Shark Tank company. She's been on the Inc. 5000. So she talks about how her company's, first of all, her products are made in the United States, but it took 9 years for her to find like the right manufacturer to help her produce these things, because initially there's a lot of trial and error, with working with a manufacturer to begin with. But this was like, she had a lot of drama along the way. And so basically my point is, even if you have a product made here and you finally get it done, it might take 9 years for you to resolve whatever issues you had.
Yeah. That's a good point that I hear from a lot of business owners too, is these tariffs are coming and going by the day, by the week, but changing your supply chain takes 6 months minimum. And, you have to do new samples, draw up new contracts. So it takes time, it takes money. And if you don't know what sort of situation you're going to be in a week from now, how do you invest in that change?
Yeah. So what's the current state of the tariff situation? So we have obviously up to 145% on Chinese products, or it's Chinese-made goods. And then it's 25% on Canada and Mexico?
Right now, there's a 10% blanket tariff on the rest of the world. And then products that fall under the USMCA United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. Those should be duty-free.
Oh, okay.
And so companies can go on the customs website and get a certificate that certifies that their products fall under that agreement. And that's one thing that, everyone should be looking into now if they qualify.
Oh, wow. But is it temporary? Is all this temporary? Like, isn't the 10% only for 3 months or something? Like
Right.
we hit pause?
Yeah, so he hit pause on the larger Liberation Day tariffs, which were anywhere from like 30 to 50%. And they were based on the U.S. trade deficit with each country.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can tell you one industry that's not complaining right now, and that's crypto. We should have known based on on inauguration night, there was the crypto ball, and apparently it was like the hottest ticket in town. We should have seen the writing on the wall. Obviously, crypto people would be happy. Brian, you've done some reporting on this world. Can you tell us why they might be happy right now?
Yeah. Crypto, sort of as a sector broadly, went really hard for Republicans and Trump during the election, just in terms of sort of campaign donations. And it is paying off for them. We are already seeing secretary appointments that are in line with sort of the regulatory goals that the crypto industry has. You have Howard Lutnick in Commerce, and you have Paul Atkins at the SEC. These are both known sort of crypto fans who are sort of looking to roll back the Biden administration's fairly aggressive crypto regulatory approach and be a little more laissez-faire about everything from cryptocurrencies to crypto exchanges. So at least in that regard, they are getting the regulatory landscape, or starting to get the regulatory landscape they want. There's already been lawsuits that the SEC was pursuing against major crypto companies that have been dropped.
Like the Ripple one?
Yeah.
So Ripple's, I guess the SEC lawsuit was dropped there, right? So there have been others?
Yeah, Coinbase is
right.
another one. That's one of the best-known cryptocurrency exchanges, and the SEC dropped a case against them. Coinbase's chief legal officer called it nothing short of a complete win. So crypto was in a bit of a winter. I think a lot of people remember like 2021-ish. There was all the hype around like the monkey NFTs and cryptocurrencies and stuff. And then especially as AI started to become sort of the hot new thing in tech, a lot of that interest fell away. It started becoming less of a focus of like Silicon Valley funding. But with this election, there's a lot more energy behind it. People in that space are really optimistic about sort of regulatory changes. There's been a number of IPO filings or rumors from various like major crypto companies. So it's a hot time to be in crypto.
Yeah, but there was a period though when the markets were kind of crashing, when the crypto markets were also crashing.
Yeah, and I think that's been dialed back a little recently, but crypto people often talk about crypto, especially like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are the two biggest cryptocurrencies by market cap and sort of the two most mainstream crypto assets generally. People often talk about them as a hedge against US dollar macroeconomic dynamics like inflation. And I think the fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum were tracking the general decline in the stock market more broadly, especially after Liberation Day, made some people a little bit skeptical of the extent to which cryptocurrency is sort of its own ecosystem. It's becoming increasingly tied up with institutional investors. You see, like Fidelity is talking about launching a stable coin.
I saw in my PayPal account, like I can invest invest in crypto.
100%. Same with Venmo. The once very stark boundaries between traditional economics and finance and crypto are becoming a lot blurrier, and that means that it's easier to be in crypto in terms of regulations and customer acquisition, but also that trends in that space are starting to track broader sort of US dollar and public market stocks a little more closely.
Yeah. This is, and I want to dig into the regulatory issue a little bit here. So there was a question about whether crypto would be regulated under the SEC or the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, so the CFTC. So I think that was decided, correct, Jennifer?
I would say what happened was the Securities and Exchange Commission has said that for the most part, they're not.
They don't
in charge.
want to.
They don't want to, which was a switch from under Gary Gensler, who said that most cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin should be regulated by the SEC. And that's why we had all of these enforcement actions. And one thing that comes up a lot when I talk to heads of crypto companies is that they want regulatory clarity. They want to know who's regulating what.
Yeah.
But then when you ask them, well, what would that look like? No one can ever give you a clear answer. It seems like there needs to be some clarity from Congress as to who should be in charge of what. And some of these agencies need to clarify what their positions are. So far, all we have is the SEC saying, this is not us.
Any sense for how the industry would be regulated differently if it was under CFTC versus SEC?
Well, the idea is that there's this ongoing debate about whether, and you guys feel free to jump in, 'cause it's very in the weeds, whether cryptocurrencies are a commodity or a security. So are they more like gold or corn or something like that, just like a product? Or are they like a security, like a stock? And that would determine which agency has regulatory oversight. So Gary Gensler's argument, former SEC chair, was that because these cryptocurrencies, they have people pulling the strings behind them, they're more like stocks. And so the SEC should be involved. Bitcoin is different because it's totally deregulated and there's no one making decisions. It's all based on the
you're
initial
still mining
code.
for these things, right? It's not like, and people can do that.
People can do that, but as far as
People can also grow corn.
yeah, I mean, I guess the thing with Bitcoin is there's no one who's making decisions about how the cryptocurrency is going to be made and run. Whereas some of these others, they might be to like fund a certain project or they're somehow tied to a person. I mean, the president has a cryptocurrency.
Right. Okay, so that's still a question of like what's actually going to happen there. Any other headwinds that the industry faces?
I would point again to the increasing interest around IPOs. We're seeing Circle, which is a major sort of stablecoin company. Stablecoins are basically cryptocurrencies that are trying to track the value of like a US dollar or a treasury bond or something. So they're a little more stable, as the name implies. Circle mints basically one of the biggest stable coins. They recently filed to go public. There's a few other major crypto companies, Kraken and Gemini, which are reportedly going public either this year or next. And I think, to the question about how much regulation does the industry itself actually want, I do think that the fact that these companies are increasingly interested in access to public markets in exchange for a little more transparency and going through the whole filing process to go public is indicative of at least how some of the bigger players in the space are thinking about regulation. You don't file to go public unless you're comfortable with at least some regulation.
One would hope.
One would hope.
Yeah. How about this? I'd love to kind of have us each talk about prediction for the year ahead.
Who knows?
Who knows? It's been so much change in the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term in office. So we really don't know what to expect. I mean, we know that Elon Musk's tenure will end at the end of May. So what happens to Doge? I have questions about this. Maybe things will calm down without Musk on Capitol Hill. He's got the Tesla takedown he needs to worry about. So hopefully maybe he'll refocus his efforts elsewhere. So that's one thing I think I'm looking forward to is maybe a little more calmer situation in DC.
There's predictions and then there's things that I actually hope will happen, right?
That's fine.
I mean, I think, and I certainly hope with trade that we see a realignment and a lowering of these tariffs, because if we don't, it is obvious that things will get very expensive. But when you're looking at what's happening in the bond markets, when you're looking at the weakening of the dollar, it really just makes you take pause, right? Especially if you travel, for example. I mean, we saw just last week that the dollar had a terrible day. I've read reports, and it's not something that is going to make a lot of people happy, but some, and this might be a fringe belief, but some have likened America to an emerging market. And that makes you think.
Well, it's certainly true for women's healthcare.
Right? Well said.
All right, Brian, what you got?
I think we'll see a major crypto company go public, and that will bring a lot more money into that space from sort of just general retail investors, but also more scrutiny, especially around, Jennifer, you mentioned that President Trump has a cryptocurrency right now. We've also seen like Javier Milei in Argentina, the Argentinian president, launch a cryptocurrency and face a lot of skepticism about sort of what it means for corruption and public accountability for a head of state to have essentially their own name brand currency. So I think we're sort of in this very pro-crypto area right now, post-election, where there's a lot of positive energy and vibes. And I think a major IPO will, on one hand, open those markets up to a lot more sort of lay retail investors, but also sort of get us back into like the FTX collapse era of a lot more scrutiny and skepticism and maybe pressure for regulation in that space.
Also, SBF could get released.
He could. There is talk that his parents are lobbying behind the scenes to have him released. And we have certainly seen Trump pardoning certain people. I mean, I agree with Brian that I think that we're going to see more bleeding of traditional finance and crypto. Just at cryptocurrency conferences and events now, you see people from major banks attending, speaking on panels. So I think that the cat is out of the bag on that. As far as tariffs, I think / hope we're going to settle on more tariffs than we had on January 20th, but we're not going to, these crazy high levels are unsustainable. And I think as the economic impacts become more obvious, I think that there will be a drawback, or maybe we'll just stay where we are now. The thing is, with all of this, there could be some big external shock, whether it's pandemic or terrorist attack or Russia invading Ukraine, and a lot of what we think is going to happen could get totally tossed up in the air and changed.
That's fair. Everything we said here today could be totally meaningless, but we endeavor to go on and try to, I mean, at the end of the day, hopefully we have more certainty. So for the business owners listening,
Yeah.
we can hope for that. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Melissa, Brian, Jennifer.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
That's all for this episode of From the Ground Up.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice. Also, if you like this episode or have suggestions of what topics you'd like to hear about, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or reach out to us on Inc. social channels.
From the Ground Up is produced by Blake Odom and Avery Miles with Diana Ransom and myself, with help from Sam Gebauer and Hawa Otori. Editing by Matt Totter. Mix and sound design by Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Be sure to read our coverage of the first 100 days of the Trump administration on Inc.com. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.